She stood at the fence in the freezing rain, staring at a colt so small and so still that the vet had already written him off. Nobody wanted him. Not the breeder, not the rescue, not anyone who passed through that muddy paddock and looked into his dull, glassy eyes. But she wanted him. And what happened between that rainy afternoon and the day an entire arena fell silent, absolutely frozen, is one of those stories that makes you question everything you think you know about grief, about will, and about what animals can sense in the people who need them most. Before we get into this story, I need to ask you something, and I mean this seriously. Have you ever felt like you were the weak one that nobody wanted to bet on? The one people looked at and quietly decided wasn't worth the effort? Because this story isn't really about a horse. It's about two broken things finding each other at exactly the right moment and refusing together to disappear. If that already says something to you, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, your city, your state, and tell me, have you ever rescued something and ended up being the one who got rescued? If this kind of story moves you, hit like and subscribe. We tell these every week, and they're always real, always earned, and never easy. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Millhaven, Tennessee, late October. The town of Millhaven sits in a valley between two long ridges that turn orange and gold every fall without fail, as if the hills are determined to be beautiful no matter what's happening down below. Down below, that October, quite a lot was happening. Harriet Gale, 61 years old, recently widowed, recently retired, and recently arrived at that particular stage of grief where the casseroles stop coming and the silence starts, was standing in her kitchen at 6:15 in the morning, pouring coffee she wouldn't drink, staring out a window at a pasture that was technically hers now. The land had belonged to her husband, Royce, for 30 years before it belonged to both of them, and to her alone. 42 acres of good grass and red clay, a barn that needed paint, two old mares who had been there so long they were practically furniture, and a fence line Royce had walked every Sunday morning with a cup of coffee and a slow, unhurried attention that Harriet had always found deeply comforting and now found devastating to think about. Royce had died in March. Pancreatic cancer, which is to say, quickly and without much mercy. He was there in February, talking about fixing the South Paddock Gate. He was gone by the second week of March. 7 months later, Harriet was still in the house. She hadn't sold the land, though two separate neighbors had made offers, one of them quite generous. She hadn't made any real decisions about anything. She fed the mares, Clover and Bess, every morning and every evening. She drove into town for groceries on Thursdays. She went to church on Sundays and sat in the same pew she and Royce had shared for 20 years, and she shook hands with people who looked at her with that particular careful tenderness that the newly widowed receive, and that feels after a while like a kind of gentle suffocation. Her daughter Priya called every Sunday evening from Nashville. She was kind and worried and busy with two young children and a job that never really stopped, and Harriet loved her fiercely and found it slightly exhausting to reassure her that everything was fine, when everything was clearly not fine. Her neighbor, Gus, an old man of 74 who raised quarter horses on the property adjacent and had known Royce for 40 years, stopped by every week or so, not to talk particularly. Just to check the fence line, or to drop off a bag of feed, or to stand at the paddock rail for a while and watch the mares move and say nothing about nothing. Harriet appreciated this more than she could easily express. It was Gus who called her on a Tuesday morning in late October. "I've got something over here," he said without much preamble. "Don't know what to do with it. Thought you might come look." Harriet drove her truck over Gus's property at 9:30. The morning was raw and grey, and the trees had started letting go of their leaves in earnest. Not the beautiful falling of peak colour, but the tired, heavy dropping of leaves that had given everything they had, and were done. The colt was in a small pen near Gus's barn. He was a paint, technically, white with patches of brown that were more smear than marking, as if someone had begun a painting and lost interest. He was small for his age, which was approximately 4 months, and he was standing with his head low and his legs splayed at a slight angle, the way horses stand when they are putting as little effort as possible into the project of remaining upright. "Mare rejected him at birth," Gus said beside her. "Breeder up in Cookville tried bottle feeding, but the fella's got a defect in his left foreleg. Bone didn't form right. He's been passed around 2 rescues. Neither one wanted the liability." He paused. "Vet said he'll probably never carry a rider, might not even grow into a useful working animal." Harriet looked at the Colt. The Colt did not look back exactly. He was too tired for that, but he turned his head slightly toward her, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and she saw that his eyes, which were large and dark and rimmed with an expression that she could only describe as exhausted patience, were watching her from beneath. "What's his name?" she asked. "Breeder called him nothing, literally wrote nothing on the paperwork." Gus shifted his weight. "Which is not what I'd call a name." Harriet said, "No, it's not." She stood at the fence for a long moment. The rain had started very lightly. "I'll take him," she said. November. Learning to stand. Getting the Colt to her property took the better part of a day. He was small enough to load without much trouble, but the process of convincing him that movement was worth attempting required patience that Harriet had not, until recently, known she possessed. She named him Wick, short for nothing in particular, just a word that meant a small flame that keeps burning when it probably shouldn't. The first week, she wasn't sure he was going to make it. He ate poorly, slept in positions that scared her, and showed little interest in the mares, who regarded him with the offended indifference of senior employees encountering an intern they hadn't been consulted about. The veterinarian she'd known since Royce's horse days, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Voss, came out on the 3rd day and spent an hour examining the left foreleg. "The cannon bone didn't develop properly," Dr. Voss told her, washing her hands at the barn sink. "There's some angular deviation. It's not going to straighten on its own, but it's also not getting worse. He's not in active pain, which is something, but he's going to be limited, Harriet. I want you to understand that." "I understand," Harriet said. "He'll never be ridden. Might always struggle with sustained movement. Best case, he's a companion animal." "That's fine." Dr. Voss looked at her steadily. She was one of those people whose directness was a form of respect. "You're taking on a significant responsibility. The care costs alone." "I know, Lena." Harriet used her first name, which she rarely did. "I have the land, I have the time, and I have—" She paused, looking out at the small pen where Wick was standing, head low, but ears slightly raised in what she was beginning to recognize as his version of alertness. "Not very much else to do." Dr. Voss left without further argument. What followed was a routine that Harriet built slowly, the way you build anything when you have no template, by finding what works and doing it again. She started spending 2 hours in the barn every morning, not training, not working, just being present. She brought her coffee. She sat on an overturned bucket near Wick's stall and read, or didn't read, and let the Colt grow accustomed to her presence as a fact of his life rather than an intrusion. By the end of the 2nd week, Wick had begun to eat with something approaching enthusiasm. By the end of the 3rd, he had started coming to the stall door when he heard her boots on the barn floor. Her daughter Priya called on Sunday evening, and Harriet mentioned almost casually that she'd taken on a Colt. The silence on the other end was eloquent. "Mum, you're 61 years old. I'm aware. You just lost Dad. You're alone out there." "I know where I am, Priya." Another silence. "Then is he healthy?" Harriet considered this. "He's getting there," she said. She didn't mention the part about the leg, or the part about the rejected paperwork, or the part about standing in the rain watching a small horse turn his head toward her and feeling, for the first time since March, something she could almost call pulled forward. Gus came by that week and stood at the fence watching Wick move around the small paddock in his lopsided, effortful way. "He's moving better," Gus said. "A little," Harriet agreed. "You talked to him." Sometimes, Gus nodded, as if this were an entirely sensible course of action. Royce used to talk to Clover when she was colicky, swore it helped. He looked at Harriet. I think he was right. Harriet didn't say anything to that. She just watched Wick make his careful way across the paddock, and she thought about all the things Royce had known about animals and patience and staying with something until it found its legs. And she thought, I am paying attention. I'm sorry I didn't pay closer attention before. I'm paying it now. December, January. The cold work. Winter came to Millhaven the way it always did, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a slow, grey insistence that got into everything. Harriet did not slow down. If anything, the cold made the routine more necessary, something to do at 5:30 when the dark was total and the house felt enormous and the absence of another person moving through it was loudest. She'd started working with Wick on basic groundwork in December, not because she had any plan for him, Dr. Voss's words had settled in her realistically, but because she'd noticed something. The Colt, despite his compromised leg, despite his slow start and his small frame and his undistinguished markings, had a quality she could only call presence. When she entered the paddock, he tracked her, not with the distracted, ear-swiveling attention of an animal checking for threats, but with a focused, whole-body attention that felt almost deliberate. He turned toward her. He kept her in the center of his awareness. She mentioned this to her neighbor Brock, a younger man in his mid-40s who'd been training horses competitively since his 20s and had won enough regional titles that his opinion carried weight. He came over one afternoon in December at her invitation, stood at the fence, and watched Wick for a long time. He's got a good eye, Brock said eventually. He watches everything. No, he watches you. That's different. Brock tilted his head slightly. I've trained horses for 20 years. Some of them have athletic ability. A very few of them have something else, a kind of sensitivity. A way of picking up on what the person needs and responding to it. He paused. Your boy there has it. He can barely walk straight, Harriet said. I know, and that's a genuine limitation, but what he has up here, Brock tapped his temple, and in here, his chest, that's not nothing. Harriet drove into Millhaven that Thursday, and on an impulse she didn't entirely understand, stopped at the library and checked out 4 books on equine communication and horse behavior. The librarian, Ruth Ann, who had known her since they were both young women and who had brought a green bean casserole to the house in March, looked at the titles and said, "Starting a project?" "I think so," Harriet said. She read the books in the evenings with the television off, and she noticed that what she was reading was matching what she was seeing, that Wick's responses to her body language, her breathing, her pace of movement were more refined and rapid than anything she would have expected from an animal so young and so compromised. She started walking differently in the paddock, slower, more deliberate. She started paying attention to where she turned her shoulders, how she held her gaze, whether she was approaching or retreating, and how the Colt responded to each shift. He responded to all of them. "You're training yourself," Gus said one afternoon, watching from the fence. "Maybe," Harriet said. "Is that bad?" "I don't think so." What she didn't say, what she was only beginning to understand herself, was that paying this quality of attention to something alive had changed the texture of her days. The grief was still there. The absence of Royce was still enormous and real, and sometimes in the early morning, almost physical, a pressure against her sternum, a tightening in the throat. But it was moving. It was no longer a wall. It was becoming something she moved through, the way you move through weather, the way Wick moved through the paddock, with effort, with accommodation, with a kind of stubborn, continuing forward. She called Priya on Sunday and told her more. "I want to come see him," Priya said. "Come at Christmas," Harriet said. "He'll be more himself by then." February, what Brock saw. By February, Wick had grown. Not dramatically. He was still small for his age, and his left foreleg still carried the slight outward deviation that gave his walk its distinctive compensating rhythm. But his coat had thickened into something genuinely handsome. The white had gone bright and clean, and the brown patches had deepened into a warm, reddish chestnut that caught the winter light well. He'd also gained 20 pounds and had begun cautiously integrating with Clover and Bess, who had adjusted their offended indifference down to a kind of tolerant coexistence. Priya had come for Christmas with her husband Denny and the children. She had stood at the paddock fence on Christmas morning in the cold, watching Wick pick his way across the frozen ground toward Harriet, and Harriet had seen something move across her daughter's face, relief or recognition, or maybe just the beginning of understanding. "He really comes right to you," Priya said. "Every time," Harriet said. Denny, who was a thoughtful man who chose his words carefully, said, "He looks at you like he's paying attention to you, not just looking." "Paying attention. That's it exactly," Harriet said. "Brock came back in February, and what happened that afternoon changed the direction of everything. He'd brought with him a woman named Elise, his partner, who worked in equine-assisted therapy at a facility in Murfreesboro. Elise was in her late 30s, compact, quiet, with the kind of stillness that Harriet recognized as professional habit. She was a person accustomed to not overwhelming animals. Elise stood in the paddock with Wick for 45 minutes. Harriet stayed near the fence. Brock stayed further back. What Elise did, as far as Harriet could tell, was very little. She stood. She breathed. She made no demands. And Wick, this small, compromised, half-formed colt who'd been rejected at birth and passed between rescues and named nothing on a government form, Wick walked to Elise within 10 minutes and stood with his nose near her shoulder and did not leave. When Elise came back to the fence, her expression was serious. "How long have you had him?" she asked. "About 4 months. And before that, breeder rejected him. 2 rescues passed on him." Elise nodded slowly. She looked back at Wick, who was watching them from the center of the paddock with his ears forward and his dark eyes steady. "He's got something I've only seen in 2 or 3 horses in 15 years of this work," she said. "He reads emotional state, not trained, innate. He walked to me and stood at my shoulder, not because I approached him correctly or offered food or was dominant or submissive. He walked to me because he could sense something I was carrying and decided to stand with it." The paddock was very quiet. "We have a therapy program," Elise said. "We work with veterans, with trauma survivors, with grief groups. We have," she paused, "a waiting list for appropriate horses. Animals who can do this work without being trained into it, who have it naturally." She looked at Harriet. "Wick's leg is a limitation. I won't minimize it. He won't be able to sustain the kind of movement a full equine therapy program requires. But for one component, for the specific work of standing with someone who is suffering, of being present without demand, he might be extraordinary." Harriet was quiet for a moment. "He's not ready," she said. "No," Elise agreed. "But I think, in time, he could be." She paused. "If you want that for him." Harriet looked at Wick, who was still watching her from the center of the paddock. She thought about what Royce would have said. She knew exactly what he would have said. He would have leaned on the fence rail and been quiet for a while, and then he would have said, "Well, he found the right place, didn't he?" "Tell me how it works," Harriet said. March, July, the long preparation. The year turned, and Harriet worked. Elise came to the farm twice a month through spring and into summer. She wasn't training Wick in any conventional sense. She was, as she explained it, giving him vocabulary, a way of understanding the particular emotional language of human distress, and a way of responding to it that was useful rather than reactive. Wick learned, for example, to differentiate between a person who was anxious and needed movement, and he would begin to walk slowly, encouraging them to follow, and a person who was overwhelmed and needed stillness, and he would stop and lower his head and breathe slowly and wait. He learned these things, Elise said, not because he was taught them, but because he already knew them, and they were being given a framework, a context, a vocabulary. Harriet watched all of it and took notes in a green spiral notebook and asked questions that Elise said were unusually perceptive for someone with no formal equine therapy background. "You're good at this," Elise said one afternoon in April. "I've had a teacher," Harriet said. She'd also started talking to a grief counselor in town, a man named Whitmore who'd been recommended by her church, and she mentioned Wick in their third session. Whitmore was intrigued enough to ask if he could visit, and he came out on a Saturday morning and stood in the paddock for 20 minutes. Wick walked to him almost immediately and stood at his left shoulder. Whitmore looked at Harriet afterward with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Does he do that with everyone?" he asked. "Everyone who needs it," she said. Whitmore was quiet. "He stood at my left shoulder," he said. "My son died 4 years ago. Heart condition. He was 29. He paused. "I've never told a client that." Harriet didn't say anything. She looked at Wick, who was still watching Whitmore with his calm, steady attention. "How did he know?" Whitmore asked. "I don't know," Harriet said. "He just does." Summer brought its own complications. Wick's leg required careful management in the heat. Dr. Voss adjusted his care routine in June, adding a specific support protocol that required Harriet's involvement twice daily. The work was unglamorous and time-consuming, and there were 2 weeks in July when Wick was sore and slow, and Dr. Voss sat Harriet down and said again carefully, "He has real limitations. Don't lose sight of that." "I haven't," Harriet said, and she hadn't. But she'd also come to understand, over the months of watching this small, imperfect, attentive animal become something more than anyone had expected, that limitations and significance are not the same thing. That the measure of a life is not what it can do without cost, but what it chooses to do despite cost. She thought about this a lot in July, while managing Wick's leg in the evening heat, and she thought it was probably one of the most important things she'd learned since March of the previous year. Gus came over in late July and leaned on the fence and watched Wick for a while. "He's something, that one," Gus said. "He is," Harriet agreed. Royce would have liked him. Harriet felt the familiar pressure in her chest, but it moved through her now instead of stopping her. "Yeah," she said. "He would have loved him." August. The day the arena froze. The Millhaven County Fairgrounds held its annual summer event in the 3rd week of August. A combination of agricultural shows, livestock competition, local crafts, and on Saturday afternoon, a demonstration event that the Fairground Committee had been experimenting with for 3 years, a public demonstration of equine-assisted therapy organized by Elise's program in Murfreesboro in partnership with a veteran support group out of Nashville. Elise had proposed in June that Wick participate. Harriet had agreed, then reconsidered, then agreed again. The logistics were complex. The drive, the unfamiliar environment, the number of people, the possibility that Wick's leg would be strained. Dr. Voss signed off with conditions: limited movement, a specific surface, controlled duration. Brock agreed to trailer him and to remain on hand. The demonstration was not, in the conventional sense, a performance. It was a working session, real participants, real emotional work, conducted in front of an audience of perhaps 200 people who sat in bleachers on one side of the covered arena and were asked by the facilitators to be quiet and to witness without commentary. There were 3 horses participating. 2 of them were large, experienced, highly trained therapy animals from Elise's facility. They were impressive, steady, patient, responsive. And then there was Wick, small, lopsided, brown and white in his imperfect paint pattern, walking with his characteristic compensating gait that was by now completely familiar to Harriet and completely unexpected to everyone in that arena who'd never seen him before. The first participant was a man named Garrett, a veteran in his 50s, 2 tours in the Middle East, who had, according to the brief introduction the facilitator offered, been dealing with severe PTSD for 11 years and had agreed to participate in the demonstration as part of his ongoing therapy. Garrett entered the arena. He stood near the center. The 2 large horses were in the space, and one of them moved toward him in a practiced, graceful arc. Garrett engaged with it. He was not unresponsive, and the horse did its work well. Then Garrett moved to the far end of the arena, and Wick was brought in. Wick walked in on his lead, Harriet at his shoulder, and she unclipped the lead and stepped back. Wick stood still for a moment. The arena was quiet except for ambient sound, the far-off noise of the fairground, the sound of breathing, the faint shift of bleacher seats. Then he walked to Garrett, not in a straight line, not quickly. In that particular, careful, deliberate way he had, that was part compensation and part intention, the walk of an animal that had decided every day of its life that moving forward was worth the effort it cost. He walked to Garrett and stopped, and lowered his head and pressed his nose very gently against the man's left forearm. Garrett stood absolutely still. The arena went completely silent. Harriet, standing at the edge, felt something happening in the air. A shift, a collective held breath, the particular quality of silence that happens when 200 people are witnessing something they don't have words for. Garrett put his hand on Wick's neck, just rested it there. And Wick, this small, rejected, imperfect, surviving animal, let out a long, slow breath and lowered his head further. And something in Garrett's face, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, began to change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of collapse you see in movies. It was quieter than that. It was the face of someone who has been carrying something alone and has, for just this moment, put it down. Garrett cried, quietly, without making a performance of it. He stood with his hand on Wick's neck and his head slightly bowed, and he cried, and Wick stood with him perfectly still, with his extraordinary attentive dark eyes and his soft, steady breath. 200 people in the bleachers did not move. Harriet was aware that she was also crying. She was not the only one. The second participant was a young woman in her 30s named Addie, a first responder who'd been present at a mass casualty event 2 years earlier and who had, as she'd said in her brief introduction, tried 3 different therapy modalities without finding traction. She walked into the space warily, with her arms crossed and her chin forward in the way of someone who has learned to protect themselves through posture. Wick turned away from Garrett, gently, slowly, a disengagement that was somehow gracious, and stood. He did not approach Addie. He waited. She stood for a minute, then 2. Then, in a movement so small that probably only the people in the front rows saw it, she uncrossed her arms, and Wick walked to her. He stopped about 3 feet away and stood, and he did something Harriet had never seen him do with anyone else. He turned slightly sideways, presenting his full flank, offering the whole of himself, the whole length of his presence, without demand. Addie reached out and put her palm flat against his side. The audience, 200 people who had come on a Saturday afternoon to an agricultural fair and found themselves inside something they hadn't expected, held its breath a second time. "I haven't," Addie said, and stopped. Her voice carried in the quiet. "I haven't been able to cry since it happened. I've been—" She stopped again. Her hand was still flat against Wick's side. She cried. Wick did not move. The third participant was a teenage boy named Lev, 16, referred by a school counselor following a period of severe social withdrawal after bullying. He came in with his hands in his pockets and his eyes down, and he stood at the edge of the arena looking at his shoes. Wick walked to him immediately, not slowly, not cautiously, with a directness that surprised everyone in the room, including Harriet. He walked to this boy and bumped his nose against the boy's lowered forehead, very gently, and the boy looked up. They looked at each other. Lev said nothing. Wick said nothing. But the boy reached up and put both arms around the Colt's neck in the way of someone who hasn't been held in a very long time, and the arena was completely, profoundly, absolutely still. Afterwards, Elise came to find Harriet, and her eyes were wet, and she didn't try to hide it. "I've been doing this for 15 years, she said. "I've never seen anything like what he just did." "He's always been like that," Harriet said. "I know. That's why—" Elise stopped. "That's why I'm not surprised. And also completely undone." Brock was quieter than usual, loading Wick into the trailer. He worked efficiently, without comment. And when Wick was settled and the trailer was latched, he turned to Harriet and said simply, "He found his purpose." "He did," Harriet said. She stood for a moment in the late afternoon light of the fairground parking lot, with the sounds of the fair around her and the trailer behind her. And Wick, presumably, already standing in his characteristic attentive stillness inside it. And she thought about a rainy morning in October when she'd driven to Gus's property with no plan and seen a small horse standing with his head down in a pen and felt for the first time in months something like a direction. She thought about Royce. She thought about grief that becomes something else, not because it stops being grief, but because it learns to move. She got in the truck. September. What changed? The video from the arena demonstration was filmed by a volunteer at the back of the bleachers. It was not professionally shot. It was a phone video, slightly unsteady, with fairground noise bleeding in at the edges. But what it captured was clear. This small, lopsided horse and his 3 encounters and 200 people not moving, not speaking, not looking away. Someone posted it online. Harriet didn't know who. By the time Priya called her on Sunday evening, not the regular time, but mid-afternoon, urgently, it had been viewed a significant number of times and was still climbing. "Mom, have you seen it? I know someone filmed it. It's everywhere, Mom." "People are..." The comments. Priya's voice was unsteady in a way Harriet hadn't heard in years. "People are writing about their own losses. People are sharing it and saying..." She stopped. Someone wrote, "I've been trying to explain grief to my husband for 3 years, and I just showed him this video, and he finally understood." Someone else wrote, "I don't know anything about horses. I haven't cried since my mom died. I'm crying now." Harriet was quiet. "Mom, is what you did with him, what he is..." "He was always that," Harriet said. "He just needed somewhere to be it." Elise called on Monday. Several media requests had come through to her facility. A documentary filmmaker in Nashville had reached out. A therapy organization in Memphis was asking about a formal partnership. A university research program studying equine-assisted therapy had sent a letter requesting a consultation. Harriet said yes to some of them. Not all. She was careful. Dr. Voss remained clear about Wick's physical limits, and Harriet guarded those limits the way you guard something important. She set one condition in every conversation for every partnership. Wick would work on his schedule, not anyone else's. He would rest when he needed to. He would participate in nothing that required sustained movement or compromised the management of his leg. He would be, always, a horse first, with a horse's needs, a horse's rest, a horse's autonomy. Everyone agreed. Gus came by on a Tuesday, as he usually did, and stood at the fence watching Wick in the paddock. "Seen the video," he said. "Half the country's seen it," Harriet said. Gus was quiet for a while. "Royce would have been very proud," he said. And then, in the way of someone who has said the important thing and doesn't feel the need to add to it, he changed the subject entirely, and they talked about the south fence for a while. It was, Harriet thought, one of the most comforting conversations she'd had in 18 months. 1 year later. Wick was 2 years old in the early fall, small still, handsome in his imperfect way, with a gait that had improved somewhat over the year under Dr. Voss's careful management and Harriet's daily attention, but that remained distinctively, characteristically his. The formal partnership with Elise's program was 6 months old. Wick participated once a week, one session, carefully structured with his movement limited and his recovery time protected. He worked with veterans, with grief groups, with trauma survivors, with adolescents who had stopped being able to speak about what had happened to them. He was never the loudest presence in a room. He was rarely the largest. He was the one that people found themselves moving toward without quite knowing why, and standing beside, and staying. Harriet kept the green spiral notebook. It was full by now, and she'd started a second. Priya came with the children in September, and the older one, a 7-year-old girl named Nessa, who was shy in the way of children who feel things deeply, spent an afternoon in the paddock with Wick. She didn't say much. She sat on the fence and watched him, and eventually he came to her, and she reached out and touched his nose with one finger, and then laughed, very suddenly and purely, the laugh of a child who has been surprised by delight. Harriet stood at the fence and felt something that she could only describe as a kind of fullness. She still missed Royce every day. She expected she always would. But she had discovered something in the 18 months since his death that she hadn't anticipated. Grief doesn't require you to stop. It doesn't require you to be finished. You can be inside it and still be moving forward, still be paying attention, still be building things, slowly, imperfectly, with a limp and a plan. She thought she'd learned some of that from a horse who had no reason to survive his first year and had decided to anyway. Whitmore, the counsellor, had ended their formal sessions in the spring, in the way that good therapy ends, not because the grief was gone, but because Harriet had built enough around it to carry it differently. At their last session, he'd said something she'd written down. The hardest thing about losing someone is not learning to live without them. It's learning that living without them doesn't mean leaving them. You can carry them forward. They travel with you. She thought about that in the paddock on a Sunday morning in September, 1 year and some months since she'd stood in the rain at Gus's fence and made a decision she couldn't fully explain. Wick came to her across the paddock in his particular way. He stopped and lowered his head and breathed out slowly. Harriet put her hand on his neck. "Hey," she said. He stood with her. Final words. So, a colt that nobody wanted. A widow with no plan. A rainy morning and a gate and a decision made in about 30 seconds that changed the next 18 months of 2 lives. And in ways that no one anticipated, changed what happened in an arena on a Saturday afternoon when 200 people stopped breathing. I keep coming back to something about this story. It's not the video, even though the video is extraordinary. It's not the arena moment, even though that moment is real and well documented. It's this. Harriet didn't take Wick home because she thought he could do something. She took him home because she recognized something in him, a kind of stubborn, quiet presence that refused to conclude itself. And in doing that, in making space for that, she gave both of them somewhere to go. Grief can close a world down. That's real. That's honest. The silences get loud, and the casseroles stop coming, and you stand in your kitchen at 6:15 in the morning pouring coffee you won't drink, and the pasture outside the window feels like a record of everything that's gone. But sometimes, something limps across a pen toward you, and you recognize each other, and then you have somewhere to be. If this story reached you today, if some part of it sat with you, I'd ask you to share it with someone who needs it. Not because they need a story about a horse, but because they might need to know that broken things find each other, and that what gets built between them is sometimes extraordinary. Hit like if this moved you. Subscribe if you want more of this. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me one thing you kept going for when you had every reason to stop. I'll be here, same as always.